hello and welcome everybody to another episode of Veterinary Tales, where we tell the stories and experiences of the victims who suffer from the veterinary malpractice of those bad actors who would rather put money, their time, anything above the care of their patients. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. Scott, how are you doing?
Hey, Colleen, how are you?
Doing well. Happy Sunday.
Happy Sunday. Getting closer to Christmas, the end of the year, New Year's.
Wrapping things up, that's for sure.
Absolutely. Cool.
Well, tonight our guest is the wonderful Tony Sirilo, and he will be talking to us a little bit about Fancy.
Yeah.
So Tony, tell us from the beginning how Fancy came to live with you guys, and what exactly happened that led to the tragic outcome.
Well, Fancy came to stay with us. It was back in about December 2014, and she was about 5.5 whenever she came to us. I originally started my sister-in-law's mother raised Himalayans, and she knew my mom was a huge cat person. We'd had cats all her life, and she wanted to know if maybe she wanted some out of her last litter. And she ended up getting a female seal point Himalayan, and Fancy was her litter mate. And she went to my sister-in-law's grandmother, and whenever her grandmother passed, she ended up coming to stay with us. Well, my sister-in-law's grandmother was a smoker, so whenever she came to us, she ended up having this horrible cough that she had maybe once, twice a day, every day. She just coughed, and wanted to take her to the vet and see if we can get something figured out about it. They suggested that we end up doing a steroid injection, which ended up causing damage to her pancreas and making her insulin dependent diabetic. So whenever she got diabetes, she had really bad issues with peeing outside the litter box, and it took a really long time to figure out what was going on and finally get it diagnosed, get it under control, and she was on 2 shots a day. She was probably like that for a good 4.5, 5 years, and it was right around the time that COVID hit that everything happened. Her and I, we're kind of an unlikely pair, would be a good way to put it, but I don't know if it's maybe just because we both have special needs that we just kind of clung together. And I've never had a relationship with a cat that was like that. I mean, she slept with me every night. I had her cage trained to eat and use the litter box, and we just had a really special bond. And it was about March or April of 2020, whenever COVID hit, that she started having issues. I think it was about 2 weeks she started having issues peeing outside the litter box, and was just really under the weather. And we took her up to the vet here in town. Well, they don't have the capabilities to test for things like pancreatitis, which she had been susceptible to from her diabetes. So we took her up to Blue Pearl Vet Hospital, which here off Memorial Road here in Oklahoma City. And it was in the middle of the night, it was probably 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. My mother took her up there. She was tired. The woman that had come to get her, because COVID happened, they came out to the parking lot to get Fancy out of the car with their pet taxi, and she had specifically asked if she wanted, or if my mother wanted a ultrasound done, which she responded no, and she didn't ask why or for what the ultrasound would be. Later on, they noted in her medical records that my mom refused to test for pancreatitis. Well, if you check on Blue Pearl's website today, it states that under pancreatitis, that the normal test would be an FLPI test. A simple blood test costs anywhere from $40 to $60. Ultrasounds more like $400. So whether or not there is a bottom line issue that drives that, I don't know. I can't say 100%, but they should have done a blood test. They shouldn't have asked for an ultrasound. So my mother said no. She went up there and wasn't seen by the normal vets till that morning. And there was no urgency in her care. I believe it was 2 days that it went before they were able to even ask about an FPI test or about doing a blood test as far as diagnosing pancreatitis. And once they finally did that, I mean, she had started going pretty far downhill by then. And we ended up having all that done. They put her on IV fluids, trying to stabilize her. And whenever they said that her blood work was fine, we assumed that it was the FBI test originally, but they hadn't done it. They also ran another test saying that she had a UTI that she previously had was gone, but it would be a day or two before we got the results back. So they kept her for 2 more days. And Friday morning they called us. I think it was Monday we originally taken her up there. Friday morning they called us. They said that she eaten a little bit of food. I mean, she hadn't hardly been eating all week, and said that they were sending her home. So, and my mom was probably $3,000 or $4,000 into this by this time. And remember, picked her up. She came home with a bottle of Clavimox drops as an antibiotic, and then an appetite stimulant, and some medication for nausea. And she wasn't home for maybe, I don't know, 2 days. They suggested that we gave her baby food. Maybe that might help with her appetite a little bit more as far as trying to get her to eat. And I mean, she liked roasted turkey breast from the deli, stuff like that. We tried all this stuff. It didn't work. And, at that time, going into pancreatitis, not getting any type of nutrition inside of her, she's going to get hepatic liptosis or start to get fatty liver disease at this point, which, to a point is irreversible. And, we put down such a large amount of money at the vet by this time that, it's starting to get ridiculous, especially since there wasn't really any urgency in her care, and we're taking her to an emergency vet hospital. So what's the point of doing that if these people don't have any type of urgency in their care? It just kind of seems like when you take an animal in there, they're more of a number. And I don't know if that number has a dollar sign in front of it or not.
That's always does.
But they don't look at these animals as sentient creatures by any means.
Right.
And I mean, you think about it, getting into veterinary medicine is more difficult than medical school. And you think that these individuals would do so, that they'd be doing so because they cared for animals. They had, and it's, there's just so many issues come to mind whenever you think about somebody that goes into a profession and then treats the animals that they're entrusted and take an oath to do so the way they do. So getting back to Fancy being home, it was probably Sunday morning that we got a call from the critical care doctor saying that she get an ultrasound. Sorry. So we ended up having to take her back to the hospital because she was just looked like she was going downhill, was hiding from us, wouldn't come anywhere near us. And I think this was on a Saturday night. They ended up hooking her back up to IV fluids. And at this point, I wasn't really sure if she was going to come home or not. She went, at this point, we finally found out that she had pancreatitis because they did an ultrasound and the results of the FPLI test came back. And this was late Sunday. We found this out. So almost a week after she'd gone into the hospital, that she'd had to deal with all this. And then they decided to do a feeding tube, which they should have done back 3 or 4 days ago when she was in there. And she'd went 108 hours without food. 108 hours. Granted, she received fluids, but she went 108 hours without any type of nutrition whatsoever. And at this point, we're about, I don't know, $6,000 into it. And granted, I wouldn't put a dollar sign on her. I mean, if I was a millionaire, I'd pay whatever I could to save her life. I don't value animals that way. And so they ended up doing all the the procedure for to go ahead and put a feeding tube in. She made it through surgery for that. And they were if you start feeding right after you do a feeding tube like that, they have a high possibility of getting refeeding syndrome. And in her medical records, it showed that they not only fed her, but then increased the amount of food that they were giving her right after they put in the feeding tube. I mean, it states there right in her medical records, because I got every bit of them after she'd passed. And Monday, we found out there was no change in her condition. She was depressed, lying around in her cage. And of course, we couldn't go see her because of COVID. And I mean, as of with so many other things that have happened during this pandemic, I can totally understand the fact that all these issues with veterinary medicine have become exacerbated because of it, because we're not able to be physically involved with the care of our animals. We have to drop them off, and maybe not so much now, but it was at the beginning. We have to drop them off. We have to take their word for it over the phone. We don't have any way to know if what they're saying is true or not. And this time she had been there and this Tuesday morning, we had a little bit of glimmer of hope, because she would start raising her head. She ate a little bit, and she was taking food in through her feeding tube still, and that she'd been kind of moving around a bit. And then it was later that afternoon that we found out that she had started taking a turn for the worse. She started having liver issues. And then they started having issues with her breathing, and they put her in an oxygenated cage. Well, breathing issues are a symptom of pancreatitis, and they couldn't tell me why she was having breathing issues. So that evening is whenever they called us up there, because they wanted to do an MRI. She started having issues with her eyes moving back or side to side in her head. And they said they could do an MRI on her brain and see if they could find out what was going on. But at that time, that they had recommended we have her put to sleep. And they weren't sure if that she was going to make it through the night. So my mother and I ended up going up there, and they sat her down on my lap and put her to sleep. And they brought her in. She was just gasping for air. There wasn't any time to, sit there and say goodbye to her, because she was just miserable. She, looked like she wasn't able to breathe. And so it was a pretty quick ordeal, and she's died right in my arms.
So what was our condolences, obviously.
Thank you.
What was the attitude of the staff, the attending physicians, and anybody else related that was involved in her case?
We know she, the woman that brought her in there, the veterinarian, she asked me if this was my first animal that I had to put to sleep. And, because I was crying, I was pretty upset about it at the time. And Yeah, I didn't say it, but I wanted to tell her this first one I've had murdered for money. But it just very callous.
Did they offer to do anything for you in the aftermath?
I mean, besides holding her to have the company come pick her up to have her cremated or have her remains picked up, not really. I mean, my mother and I were just, I mean, they offered us a room to sit in. That's about it.
So after that happened, was there any further contact with them week, 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, anything like that?
The only contact I had with them was to get her medical records, and I had never heard anything from them at all.
So when you requested the medical records, did they just hand them over to you? Did they give you a hard time or anything?
No, they did. They just handed them to me. That, I mean, it wasn't a pretty tough ordeal or anything to get them from them.
Okay.
They didn't seem very resistant, but they also, you know, I don't really think that they feel like they did anything wrong.
Well, they never do. Hardly ever do.
And, you know, I understand that veterinary malpractice in itself is something somewhat of a vague term. It's extremely difficult to prove that there's any type of intent or, you know, gross negligence. Extremely difficult to prove. And, you know, a lot of people act out of emotion instead of logic when it comes to stuff like this. But, you know, I poured over her medical records for days and just kind of put two and two together out of it. It just plays out as a story if you read through them.
So it sounded like you and Fancy had such a strong bond, and this was such a, you know, devastating turn of events that you couldn't have anticipated. How did you cope with that? What did you do to emotionally get through that process afterwards?
Well, I can say I'm probably still not at this point. I mean, it's tough whenever you have someone that sleeps you every night that's not there anymore, you know.
Yeah.
But I mean, it gets easier through
Yeah.
time.
But you're always suffering. It's been over 4 years for me, and I don't think I'll ever totally heal. I don't think anybody will ever totally heal from something like this.
I don't think you do either.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so do you have any final thoughts or any comments or anything about anything?
Well, you know, I wish that commercialized veterinary medicine would be something that is more stringently observed by members of legislative members, of people that could change things, could make a difference. I think that what you're doing as far as putting out Joey's legacy, putting out, you know, this documentary, these books, I think that makes a big difference. I think that's a huge step forward in doing so. And I hope it really takes hold. It seems to be.
Yeah, we're making progress, Tony. We're definitely making progress.
But
Right.
and doing these podcast stuff helps too. I mean,
Yeah.
it's pretty much anything you can. And I wish that people that decide to get into veterinary medicine in the future might, you know, look upon things like this and take that into account.
Well, I sent a letter one time to the University of Florida School of Veterinary Medicine, letting them know that what I do, and would they be interested in having me come in and talk to their first year veterinary class and just kind of relate some of my experiences. The response was, thank you for your offer, but you know, the curriculum you're offering doesn't fit into what we do. Translation, get lost.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's still something we need to work on for sure.
Right. And that's another thing is the administration for schools like that, the veterinary boards that oversee see disciplinary action in cases like this. Even if you have a clear-cut case of malpractice, you still have to deal with the veterinary board that's gonna, chastise them. And when I say chastise, we're talking about a slap on the wrist.
On the wrist, exactly.
So,
And that's why since there's no firm and fair discipline with these veterinarians, that's why they never learn and nothing ever gets done. And that's why we're stuck in the mess we're in.
exactly.
So that's why we try to, do what we can and disrupt and make change. And by folks like you coming on and telling your stories, it definitely helps make a difference.
Yeah.
Tony,
thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for being here. And Colleen, you have any final thoughts or anything?
Yeah, just so sorry. There's no words that can express condolences for situations like that. But thank you for coming here and telling your and Fancy's story.
Thank you, Colleen. I appreciate it.
Thanks
so
Tony.
much, God.
Take care.
You too.